of mine, as well as wears many hats. He's the Chief Medical Officer, Information Officer at Odessa, Texas, at one of the medical, what's the name?
Medical Center Hospital.
Medical Center Hospital. But I first met him at a retreat for Doximity. Doximity is something like a LinkedIn for doctors. And I think I was the one with the least number of Doximity friends, and actually I went on it of embarrassment because I didn't want to be there without any friends. But Arun, I met him there, and there were other physicians who were more technical savvy and trying to understand how we can embrace technology as opposed to be afraid of it. And from there we stayed in touch, and one day I got this message from Arun saying that, look what we have done online. And you know, truly speaking, as physicians, we have this persona around us, right? Like we are doctors and we can't be challenged or something. And suddenly this person, he is at a relatively higher position, but he went on to Kickstarter. And what was amazing was not only to put yourself out there, because you can easily ridicule a person, not only that, but he did something really phenomenal. That is to put a very boring aspect of medicine, which is bacteria and antibiotics, and you know, truly speaking, infectious disease is one of the most interesting, but on the other side, tedious topics of medicine. But what he did was he made it interesting. So I'm not going to steal his thunder, but he made it, he explained it in such a way, along with his collaborator, that the common denominator, that is a layman, was able to understand it. Not only understand it, but invest in it. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Mathews to tell us about his great endeavor and how we can use gamification in medicine and reach out to more people.
Fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Parmer, you're so kind. Well, gosh, after that, I almost feel too embarrassed to continue. But this particular discussion is going to largely revolve around the basic fundamental concepts of game design as how two practicing physicians who knew nothing about game design sort of stumbled through our way in the process of developing a small startup. So if there are any game designers in the room, my apologies. You may exit stage left because you will find this talk somewhat obtuse and very, very simplistic. So I apologize in advance. But for those of you that kind of like to do a little bit of conceptual blending, which is you take concepts from one domain area and bleed them into others and try and create hybrids, oh gosh, that's the stuff that really really makes my toes curl. And so we'll also be giving you a little bit of backstory about the process of setting up our little company and what the impetus was for the development of some of our concepts. And then hopefully by the end of this, I'll also kind of walk you through some of the current things, some of the current iterations of game application within healthcare and the healthcare IT space that are occurring now as we speak. And so hopefully by the end of this talk you'll have a basic understanding of some of the fundamental principles of game design, some of the key mechanics involved in game design, and then secondly you'll have an understanding of what are some of the examples being used around the country and in fact around the world of the blending of game design with healthcare applications clinically, as well as healthcare education, which is kind of the domain that I'm very interested in. So let's go ahead and get started. And I should, since we're in the disclosures and disclaimer space, for those of you that have a little bit of motion sickness propensity or vertigo, I am using the Prezi platform. And I've heard on blog postings that at some point, folks that, you know, when there's lots of transitions, start doing a little bit of this. And I've not had anyone actually throw up at my talk yet. And since we are on camera, I would appreciate if you do feel the urge to sort of hit your vagus nerve. Please, in fact, look away from the screen during the transitions and we will get through this somehow. All right. So, yes, like I mentioned before, this talk is about gamification in medicine and clinical education. And in fact, I, along with my wife, run a small company called Core Medical. So it's not so much a conflict of interest as it is a confluence of interest, or an interest salad, if you will, whichever you like to call it. So, so let's get started with the healthcare hurdle. So when I have discussions with patients, the inevitable thing that's happening in my head, after you have a lot of discussions with a lot of different patients, you kind of have this out-of-body experience a little bit. And you're talking, and you can see yourself smiling and nodding and doing the hand thing, and the patients are looking concerned, and you're explaining things. But then you pull away, and you're thinking to yourself, how much of this is really getting through? Is my patient comprehending what I'm saying? After I leave 20 minutes from now, if I were to quiz he or she on what I had just said, would they really truly understand it? And would they, would it impact them in such a way that, they'll internalize it and actually do some of the things I say? They'll consider reduced proportions. They'll consider better control of their glucose. They'll consider doing more activity. And I call that concept the care chasm, right? So we train ourselves as physicians to become these sharp instruments of good and education. We go through years of training and the pain of residency, and it all comes down to me, especially as an internist. There's a lot of talking and waving of hands and educating, and it turns into words, and then how effectively you communicate those words to that patient becomes the effectiveness of the intervention. So if I have a 5-minute conversation with a smoker that somehow results in them deciding, it's time. I gotta put the smokes down. I gotta try something else, vaping, whatever. I gotta do something. Then that's an effective medium. But so many times in healthcare, we worry about the effectiveness of our communication, our ability to engage. And that's the neat thing about game theory, game design. It is the science of engagement. It is, in fact, understanding what causes those little dopamine receptors to trigger when you're playing that game of Candy Crush or Angry Birds, and you keep coming back and playing that. No one's asked you to play that game. You're playing it of your own volition. That's entirely something powerful. So the key is getting to that secret sauce and appreciating just how powerful these things are. And there's a lot of folks that are very tempted to kind of write the idea of games off. And it's understandable. I mean, we use ridiculous colored fonts. We talk about video games and saving the universe and things that sometimes seem a little bit disconnected and abstract from the real world. But we've all seen how games have the ability to capture attention and drive people to push themselves to perform difficult and sometimes even frustrating tasks. Engagement levels with some games even lead to addiction levels behaviors, which is pretty impressive. And we've all seen those reports of teenagers that spend countless hours in front of video games, and even seniors that spend all of their time at card games and slot machines. So what's causing those kinds of toxic behaviors? Well, it's addiction. It's addiction psychology. And so if we're able to sort of drill into that special sauce that makes these games addictive and then turn it around for a force of good, could we take those engaging properties within gaming and game theory and use them to improve health and well-being? And that's essentially what we're going to be exploring today. So games motivate humans on several levels because they tap into basic human psychosocial needs. We are a little bit beyond Maslow. So we've gotten sort of the shelter, we've gotten the food in our bellies, and we're comfortable organisms. Now we're in the self-actualization layer. And so a little bit post-Maslowian self-actualization, what things drive human beings? A lot of studies have sort of explored, and the good folks in the cognitive psychology realm have done a lot of literature distilling down these concepts: competition, escape, social interaction, and recognition. So really the beauty of a game is that it gives you a goal, and people work longer and harder if you give them a goal. This is Deborah Lieberman in the Institute for Social Behavioral and Economic Research, sort of summating some of the CogSci data on game theory. By the way, when I use the term game theory, what I'm really talking about is applied game theory, right? So true game theory, that's John Nash, A Beautiful Mind. It's really not as exciting as colorful as this. If you've been to a true game theory lecture, it's pure mathematics. I mean, it's probability to an exponential degree. It's pre-test. It's equations that are just a little bit dizzying. And so applied game theory is the capturing of those fundamental concepts and the application of those into environments where you can actually make a difference, and you can see the results that are scored. You can compete against those scores or other people, and that's where we get into the realm of applied game theory. So I just wanted to clarify that. So how can we use the power of games to help health? Well, instead of just talking about it, let's look at an example. Let's look at the example of rehabilitation from ankle surgery. So traditionally, ankle surgery rehabilitation requires patients to do a series of exercises on their own several times a week. It requires discipline in maintaining this routine. It is an additional chore to find time for these physically strenuous activities and to do it sort of again and again. So now let's compare that to a game that you may have played called Twister. So this is a game where players have to contort their bodies into various and comfortable positions to win. Like ankle rehabilitation, it's physically strenuous and can be exhausting and a little bit frustrating. But people will literally push themselves and play for hours, especially if a good 12-year Macallan Scotch is involved or some sort of libation. So just be advised, this is not a talk about encouraging the use of alcohol in rehabilitation, although that would be a fascinating exploration. So why are the attitudes towards ankle rehabilitation and Twister different? And they all have to do with the application of fundamental game elements, which include play, social competition, that change that dread of, oh, I have to do this, to, oh my goodness, I want to beat you, I'm going to do this. And so that's what we're getting towards. And we're getting towards an overarching umbrella concept called game engagement. So game engagement. Now we're drilling into that. Remember that secret sauce I mentioned in terms of what do we define as a reproducible metric that we can operationalize and put into our healthcare initiatives to get the same levels of engagement and excitement when you play a game, and that's game engagement. So getting people to play a game that gets them into something called a flow state is truthfully the holy grail of any sort of game engagement mechanism. And so one layer below game engagement is the cognitive psychology term flow state. So what is flow state? The flow experience. So this state allows one to forget the outside world. Let me talk a little bit around it, and then we'll get into actually the specifics of it. You forget a little bit about the outside world, you lose track of time, and truthfully, designing the right flow experiences have been shown to affect behavior. So let's talk about that in real terms. So those moments when you are implicitly focused on a particular task. So for the proceduralists among you, It's the surgeon sort of manipulating a viscera that he can't actually see. He's just doing it by touch. For the pastry chefs among you, it's when you're kind of making that fourth pastry flour. For my son, when I watch him play with his Legos, I can tell when he's sort of starting to hit the flow state, because it takes me 2 or 3 times to call his name, and his breathing changes. He's just, and his breathing goes longer, and he's completely relaxed, and he's in that powerful state of extreme concentration. And that's the state that we're trying to aspire to when we create these game experiences. The term flow experience was coined by the American psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I actually went on YouTube to find out how to pronounce his name, and I think that's a reasonable approximation. People in this state are calm, focused, and so engaged that they forget the outside world and lose track of time. In fact, the most successful and engaging sticky games, that's kind of the term used by game designers. It's sticky. It makes me want to get back in there and keep playing. Do this very well. So the key is to make the experience so enjoyable that players feel an overwhelming compulsion to continue playing the game. And that's what a flow experience is. And if you get flow experiences happening in your designed experiences, which are gamified, then you have an increased chance of success. You have an increased chance of people coming back and playing the game through. So our friends in cognitive psychiatry land, psychology land, have done a great job in distilling sort of these specific operational criteria that increase the likelihood that a state is sticky or a flow state. One, it requires skills. So it requires some procedural, technical mastery before you can kind of start entering into those states. 2, it provides clear goals and feedback. 3, it requires concentration at the task at hand. And 4, it implies a partial loss of self-consciousness and transformation in time. So those moments for me, I can tell you when I'm putting in a central line and I've got the angle of the catheter just right, and I know just as I'm sort of pushing that catheter in and looking at the ultrasound image, everything is, my breathing changes, I start to hear sort of Brahms playing in my head, and then all of a sudden the syringe fills with dark venous blood. Hooray. Not bright red blood, because all of a sudden you've cannulated an artery and now you have an ABG, which is okay too. Some internal medicine humor. I apologize. That's what a flow state is. And sorry, it's just okay. So now let's talk about Csikszentmihalyi's flow experience. And by the way, that's him. And game designers around the world, you know, he is definitely the guy. And so, sorry, I apologize if I'm getting nauseated again. Sorry. So here's the chart. On this axis is challenge, and on this axis is skills. And really what you want to do is find a balance between those two. If it's too challenging, it becomes an anxiety-laden experience. It becomes frustrating and people abandon it. If it becomes too rote and boring and you get too good at it, then you abandon it. These are the dotted lines of abandoning the task. The key is, and that's why when you play games, typically games involve levels. So as you're leveling up, that first set of skills, rules, and requirements that you obtain in the first few levels, you have to use those in new and interesting ways as the challenges get harder. And that's why everything has to level up in terms of skill to maintain this thing called flow state. So let's talk a little bit about Game Design 101. And this is for the game designers among you, probably all very old news, but we'll fly through some of it. So as long as, so we have the cognitive psychology requirements, how do we go about actually building a game? And this is, we can divide games kind of in our world into sort of this sports physical world, the tabletop, board game type of world, and then digital. And so this encompasses all three. And then we'll actually do a bit of a deeper dive into why digital games or video games are so compelling and what the implications are for those in the health IT space. So if these game concepts are tightly related and complement each other, they increase the likelihood of flow states. And these elements that we call the foundations of game design are mechanics, story, aesthetics, and varying levels of technology. So what are the mechanics of game design? The mechanics in a nutshell are the operational procedures and rules of the game. What do I have to do to win? What do I have to do to lose? You describe the goals, you dictate how players can succeed or fail at accomplishing these goals, and then you describe what happens when players try to take various actions. Games that are mechanistically very heavy tend to be games such as strategy games, or this is a real-time strategy game. I think this is a screenshot of Civilization. Very rule-based, very operational. So as you're playing the game, you can directly see the consequences of your actions moment to moment. And there's a whole separate discussion on turn-based strategy versus real-time strategy, which is more cognitively challenging, but I think that's for another day. The next part of game design is story. Every game has a story, and it can be a simplistic story. I mean, the story in Angry Birds is there's some green pigs, and they stole the eggs from the red birds. Now, that's the story. I mean, that is the primary conflict that has spawned a multi-billion-dollar gaming industry around these green pigs and red birds. But there is a story. So it's the sequence of events that unfolds as the game progresses. It can be linear, pre-scripted, or branching and emergent. And it gives the game context or a backdrop for the activities within it. An example of an extremely story-driven, character-driven game in the last few years is a game by Santa Monica Studios, Naughty Dog, The Last of Us, which I don't know if you've played it, but man, it is a pretty compelling, powerful story experience. You really start to invest in these characters and care about what happens. And to me, it is really close to the pinnacle of story-driven gameplay. So aesthetics are important. So we've, as human beings, we're drawn to things that are well designed, that are functional, that are pretty. We're drawn to the movies of Scorsese or Kiarostami, and that's implicit in terms of our desire for entertainment. And so aesthetics derive how the game looks and feels, and really this has the most direct relationship to a player's experience. It sets the tone for the game and is responsible for immersing the player in it. So typically I run a small video for a trailer for the game called Journey, which came out about 2 to 3 years ago. And it's just it's a wonderful example of, so Austin Wintory is a soundtrack composer, and it melds how the process of creating the music for the game was done. It's fantastic, but this is just a screenshot from that. So aesthetics are really important for creating this continually engaging field as well, in addition to the flow state. And then lastly, we have technology. And the good part about technology is that it can be high-tech or low-tech, paper and pencil or animated images or even highly rendered graphics. And so the technology piece is largely driven by typically your budget. And so that's why we started off with a tabletop card game. So, but it does not have to be limited in that regard. So how many of you are familiar with this device, the Oculus Rift? It's a show of hands. All right. How many of you are just like devastated that Facebook bought Oculus Rift? Thank you. Okay. All right. I belong to this. So what is the Oculus Rift? Well, 21-year-old inventor slash tinkerer with perhaps one of the coolest names for an inventor. I guess it's a Southern California thing. Palmer Luckey goes on some innovation forums and is just fascinated with the concept of headsets, things that you put on your face and create sort of a semblance of VR. He's just a brilliant kid, and he starts attaching little gyros to the thing and creates this prototype, which gets the attention of the industry, specifically a gentleman named John Carmack, who was the founder of a gaming studio and is largely given credit for inventing the genre of the first-person shooter id Software. John Carmack has made his millions and millions of dollars. John Carmack joined Oculus as chief technical officer to be an employee of this 21-year-old kid. I mean, just fascinating. And if you've spoken to people or watched YouTube videos of people that have put this thing on, I mean, it is on the, I think, 180 to 200 millisecond retinal retention rate. So you put this thing on, and as you're moving your head, the entire frame is changing, and it feels like that promise of true virtual reality that we've been kind of seeking out over these many last few years and episodes of Star Trek. So I genuinely feel that the Oculus Rift is going to be groundbreaking. That feeling has cooled a little bit since I found out that Facebook acquired them. But the good news is competition is king. So Samsung and Sony have reverse engineered their own headsets. So I genuinely believe that 2015 moving forward is going to be the time when we see a seismic shift in what gaming experiences are all about and what immersion is all about. But that's just my futurism rant.
So what is Oculus? I'm sorry.
So it's a platform for virtual reality. So so that gentleman there, he has an Oculus Rift device on his head, and those two are creating two stereoscopic images, creating sort of a 3D resemblance of a world. If he turns his head, the entire world also turns. So in about, I think the term they use in Oculus is conditioning. So it takes about 30 seconds before you're conditioned, and that means that your frontal cortex fully believes that you're in this world. And so you'll see videos on YouTube where like a person is on a chair and they're doing the roller coaster demo, and the hands are flying and they're just holding on and screaming, and it's just imagine a survival horror game with the red. I don't even want to think about it. So let's move on, and we'll pick up the pace a little bit. So game mechanics are the sort of the building blocks on how you make games even more sticky and compelling. And we'll just kind of fly through these. So everyone knows that competing in teams is a little bit more compelling than just playing on your own, with the lights off. But not necessarily. Countdown is a mechanism or a mechanic you can put into a game. A game is pretty fun, but then all of a sudden, if you put a timer, you're creating a sense of stakes, and then all of a sudden, things become more intense just by definition of having a timer. So that's the countdown principle. Surprise and chance. Every once in a while, the gun will will have an empty chamber, or you'll run out of bullets, or there will be some crazy thing that happens that tremendously adds to gaming experiences as well. And lastly, social encouragement, and I'll mention this a little bit more in another piece, but social encouragement, I mean, peer support networks are extremely powerful, and then that's why you know, Facebook and Twitter are where they are, because they understand the behavior changing ability of human networks and the interaction through human networks. So let's pull back from the general description of game design and dive in a little bit into digital games, and sort of games that are primarily played on computers and consoles. And then exploring each of the operational criteria as to why these are uniquely placed and actually sometimes a little bit more powerful than traditional gaming approaches. We'll also explore what some of the implications for healthcare are because of those individual nuances in digital games. So let's start off just a 35,000 foot overview. There are 4 characteristics as determined by Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman. Sort of a tone in the world of game design is a book called The Rules of Play, and they coined these 4 concepts: immediate and narrow interactivity, information manipulation, automated complex systems, and network communication. So let's just talk a little bit about each, and then we'll get into the examples. That's where things get a little bit more interesting. So what's immediate and narrow connectivity? Well, the gentleman there is holding a laptop. If the laptop had an artificial intelligence associated with it, it would not make any decisions about, you know, the human being interacting with it. Its 2 points of engagement are the keyboard and the trackpad. So those, as far as the AI is concerned, the only thing that is out there is something that's sending me commands via keystrokes and something that's pushing around a mouse on the screen. And so that's a challenge with game design, because computer games sort of in a very big way limit your interaction with a particular 3D space or realm in the form of a gamepad or a mouse pad. And that's difficult, because in healthcare, just like real life, is three-dimensional. It's 256,000 different shades of gray. It involves smell and taste and body fluids and measuring of blood glucose. So it involves movements that can be limited by disease. And so when we're designing games for folks that may be in the healthcare setting, we have to kind of open up those layers of interactivity. Keyboards and mice are dependent on people without functional disabilities. And so thankfully, moving forward, we have concepts like Kinect and the Wii Motion Control Codecs that allow for larger interaction with less narrow interactivity. So that's sort of my little 2 cents on the concept of immediate and narrow interactivity. Information manipulation. So what is this really about? So computer games are really good at displaying data. So the perfect example for this is when you get into your car, you're driving down the street, every once in a while I hope, you glance at your dashboard and you can see exactly how fast you're going, you'll see how much fuel is left in the tank, you'll see if the indicators are on, if the lights are on, and that concept of the dashboard, video games are very good at doing that. In fact, when you play first-person shooters, you'll see a heads-up display kind of giving you situational awareness moment to moment. And we could use that. The neat part about it is that technology can make games richer by accessing, storing, manipulating, and processing large amounts of that data. And that data, when presented in a meaningful and easy-to-read format, can help people see patterns of behavior. So the perfect example here is the quantified self movement. So I stick a Fitbit on myself or a Nike fuel band. And now all of a sudden, in the next 3 weeks, I have access to a stream of data. In fact, 2 months ago when I had a Fitbit before I had to return it because of the nationwide recall. By the way, I didn't get the nickel allergy, but the watch stopped working, so I thought I'd send it back. Something really interesting started to happen, and that was, and you know, it happened for everyone, so it's not that interesting, but I noticed on the days that I would round with the Hospitalist Fellows, and we would round, and you walk around and you do stuff, right? I would hit 12, 14,000 steps a day. On the days that I was a CMIO, I would barely hit 4,000 steps. I mean, I was literally, but if you calculated the amount of work this finger would do, clicking like close emails, and no, you can't have that on your iPhone. So it spurred me on to say, wow, on my CMIO days, I need to really push to get to the gym or get out there and run or run around with the kids to hit that, you know, that quote unquote 10,000 steps a day. And just having access to that data stream changed my behavior, which is really powerful. And that's the kind of thing that, that gaming technology allows us to do. It allows us to create information, manipulate it, and put these data feeds in easy to read mechanisms in analytic dashboards that then drive behavior change. So automated complex systems is the next piece that digital games tend to have. And let's see, what are automated complex systems? In a nutshell, instead of reading the word automated complex system, read the word rules engine. So in our hospital, when a patient has had a round of TPA for a stroke, and you try and give them aspirin, our rules alert kicks off, says, hey, you can't give this patient aspirin, they just had TPA. And so rules engines are something that, you know, in medicine we're getting very excited about. We're like, well, we call it advanced clinical decision support, but really it's just an if-then statement. And games have been doing this literally since, you know, if the pixel goes past the goal, then you get a point, and multiple points results in a win. So they've been doing it since Pong, literally. So before we congratulate ourselves in medicine, we can look over the fence and see what they're doing with automated complex systems and rules engines. When you drive your car off the pier in GTA 5, not only does the ragdoll physics engine kick into gear, but then when you hit the water, the physics engine actually changes based on rules to mimic fluid states. Now, I mean, it's just crazy. And if we could take that level of elegance and apply it to specific scenarios, not general medicine. I mean, belly pain has still a pretty big, scary differential, but specific scenarios. If we took these automated complex systems, we could do some pretty powerful things in terms of advanced clinical decision support. And that's really the point I wanted to make there. Another example would be instances where, say we were monitoring HbA1c levels, and we had a series of readings that were very high. A rules engine could actually then go in and trigger and say, hey, we need to notify the care provider, but we also can make some reasonable adjustments to your basal insulin level requirements, because it appears that your basal insulin needs have gone up. And so those are the neat kinds of things that rules engines do. And lastly, networked communication. So this is that sort of the night fuel band. As you're running, you can set this thing called Cheers on, which is a little bit creepy, which is as you're running, people that see your post on Facebook, they can say, if they hit like, you're getting like, hey, well done, as you're running. It's just, wow, just a little too connected if you ask me. But that's because peer support networks are tremendously powerful drivers of behavior, as evidenced by social media and communities like Patients Like Me and a number of other patient-driven communities that come together and support themselves. In fact, some of my research at Hopkins had to do with creating novel peer support groups, and we'll talk about that momentarily. So let's get to the actual sort of meat of the discussion. What is happening out there? Where have teams of people come together in multidisciplinary teams, sat down with game designers, sat down with patients, sat down with providers and said, hey, how can we use some of the more compelling aspects of game theory and use it to make our interventions a little bit more sticky? And so let's run through a couple. So once again, gaming efforts have shown encouraging behavior change, improving mental outcomes, accelerating brainstorming, furthering R&D. Those are some of the larger areas that we're going to explore with some of these specific examples. So let's take a simple basic one. This is the no-duh one. Expresso Fitness is a company that have developed a immersive gaming sort of spin game, if you will, and as you're on the cycle, you're controlling this character on the screen, you're avoiding obstacles, and the strength of your pedaling directly relates to the speed of your pedaling and the number of power-ups. So it helps maintain a level of intensity, it distracts the player from the effort, and improvements in terms of weight loss and sticking with the program we're seeing just after 3 months. So interesting, interesting. So in terms of future implications, yes, if we pair physical activity to game concepts, things are a little bit more engaging. And you know, we've all seen these instances where we use Connect to help individuals lose weight, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's not all that groundbreaking, but it's out there. Now, Snow World to me is really super cool. University of Washington, sort of R&D group, put together a VR environment. This is pre-Oculus Rift, and they did it specifically for their burn unit. And so what they noticed was folks that, so the most upsetting thing about being in a burn unit is dressing changes and debridements, right? And so you're in this saline tub, debridements. So all the dead skin needs to come off, and you use like a little liquid jets to take them off, and sometimes. So what they found was, like, if people were given this little VR helmet, their opiate requirements would actually decrease. So what was on this? What was the program that they were watching? Well, it was called Snow World. So you're literally flying through these slopes of snow. You're shooting things with snowballs. I mean, it's gamified, so it's goal-oriented, and you have specific objectives. But the fascinating piece of this was the relation to decreased opiate usage, and that to me, you know, is really compelling, because it falls on something called the gate control theory of pain, where, you know, if you have a certain amount of inputs on the I think it's the delta fibers, they actually literally switch off, and you have the perception of pain literally drops. And so studies like this can only suggest this, and you can't prove pain-related studies in burn patients, you know, through a randomized control trial, because there's a level of ethics involved. Anytime pain is involved, you want to be extra careful. But to me, just fascinating stuff. So once again, the visual stimulus and gameplay distracts the pain signals, et cetera, et cetera. So the future implications are, of course, you know, we can explore low-cost treatments, and we can explore reduction of opiate analgesia, which, you know, in and of itself is associated with increased morbidity and mortality in acute inpatient stay. Gabarello is fascinating. Physical recovery and rehabilitation. This pairs a physical recovery support robot called a Locomont robot in patients that have strokes or neurodegenerative disease, and it pairs it with a game called the Gabarello. And so I actually forget which university is doing this. I think it might be University of Melbourne. But here's what it looks like, and it's pretty cool. I mean, here you have this huge locomote robot, and the individual is playing this game, and haptically, as you're moving on the robot, Gabriella's moving. So you'll see this, this slope here will result in kind of a slight increase in the gradation of pressure, and then they may have to do a small jump here. So you're kind of walking your character through this this interactive world using this many $100,000 robot as your controller. So pretty fascinating, and there's a screenshot from the actual game. So HOPE, what is HOPE about? HOPE was our little project at Hopkins circa 2004, 2005. This stands for the Hospital-Based Online Pediatric Environment. And the concept was fairly simple. We dealt with a small cohort of kids on pediatric, in the pediatric dialysis, hemodialysis unit. So this was an outpatient unit, and a problem that they had, this is fascinating, when you deal with sort of adolescents and teenagers, and we talked about this earlier, there's a sense of immortality, even Hodgkin's lymphoma, end-stage renal disease, and what they noticed was there is a very definite proportional increase in death when an individual skips their dialysis treatments, right? I mean, that's the no-duh statement. But these kids were skipping their dialysis treatments, and the dialysis treatments were really as a bridge to get them on a transplant waiting list. But despite that, despite all the counseling, despite the many, many thousands of dollars put into keeping these individuals alive, kids are kids, and kids hate the fact that they're sick, they have body dysmorphic disorder, they have increased propensity to childhood depression, and that results in skewed decision making. So what the nephrology, the pediatric nephrology attendings were talking to us in the IT department were that, is there some way we can get them to be more compliant with their outpatient dialysis schedules? So we devised this concept called HOPE, which was a very simple, this is 04, so we used Generation 1 Xboxes and we linked them up by network. And we created competitions amongst the groups of kids. And so really what they were used to, when you sit down and get dialysis, it's a pretty daunting task, right? You're hooked up to this monolithic machine. You sit there for 3 hours while the entire blood volume of your body is exchanged in and out and clean. And literally your two options while that 3 hours is happening are read a book, stare at a wall, or look at daytime television, which is, I don't know, which is worse, to be honest with you. Reading a book is fine, but not a big group of readers in this group of inner city youths, unfortunately. So what we did was we gave them access to an Xbox Live-like environment. We created competitions around gaming, around car racing, around games of soccer, football, basketball, and we noticed a substantial increase in compliance with hemodialysis. Now, this was, we were putting video game consoles into a high acuity clinical unit, so this was just a feasibility, safety and feasibility trial. But we did see some suggestions of improved quality of life per some simple surveys, better communication, better engagement. Turns out that when kids are in a gaming environment, they really let loose. They start to complain. They complain about their lives, the doctors that are taking care of them, how lame this video game thing is that Dr. Mathews is making them do. But it turns out that complaining, that outlet is actually really healthy for people. So our supposition was that outlet was part of the novel peer support network that comprised of HOPE. So that was HOPE, and these are two of our guys actually playing the game. Remission 2, so Pamela Omidyar started a small company called the HOPE Lab and made a game all about cancer for pediatric oncology patients. And she's married to a gentleman by the name of Piero Migliar, who runs a small company called eBay. So, so this company managed to get some funds and actually make the game, which is great to hear. And so it really encourages kids to understand the concepts of basic oncology treatment, and starts getting, half of what we do when we teach new concepts to people is teach them vocabularies, teach them ontologies. And concepts like the various different oncology medication regimens, these are pretty chunky concepts. And so gamifying them and then turning them into goal-directed behavior was a way to actually start teaching these kids about their therapies. Moving on, so we're moving into sort of the cognitive and educational side of things. This was a concept called brain gaming or brain fitness. A couple of years ago, Nintendo released a game that encouraged people to do a number of small cognitive tasks on their Game Boy Advance, and got a lot of industry recognition. This company went further and created a headset that actually tracks EEG waves and creates a number of cognitive tasks that while you're doing them, if you're not in a state of calm, and what they've approximated is something close to a flow state, the actual screen starts to get fuzzy and blurry, and so it requires you to stop, you're daydreaming about why you should be posting this on Facebook, and then the screen sort of starts to clear up again, and then you can actually complete the cognitive task. So it's kind of like mindful meditation simulation, if you will. It encourages trying to tap on that area that is the flow state. What are the implications for something like this? Well, we got to interact with a group while we were at Hopkins. There's a neat group at NYU doing some fascinating work on cognitive plasticity and the use of gaming to sort of offset the progression of Alzheimer's dementia. Varghese et al. Varghese was the principal investigator. What he showed was that simple tasks, simple things like completing crossword puzzles daily, bizarre things like ballroom dancing, all had statistically significant effects on delaying the onset of Alzheimer's dementia. Pretty powerful stuff, and we were in the talks to add a true gaming piece. So we were setting up, going to a nursing home, teaching them how to play Civilization, and trying to measure their cognitive performance using a number of survey instruments. Unfortunately, that fell through when turns out I'm a foreign medical grad, and so I have to do this thing called a J1 waiver, and my visa situation sort of reared its ugly head, and I had to move to New Mexico and be an internal medicine doctor. So I don't know whether they were able to push that through, but from what I've been told, that's still on the shelf. So that to me would be a fun project to kind of explore again in terms of cognitive plasticity in gaming. And lastly, now we're getting into true education. So how can we use game concepts to further advance training of medical practitioners? And there's a group called Dr. Hero, and they focus primarily on simulation training of physicians. The physicians train in game scenarios to build up procedural memory. They have the chance to practice their response with specifically in regard to obstetric emergencies. It makes it so that skills and decisions become part of their muscle memory. That's a terrible term. So that in a real emergency situation, correct procedures and techniques are really akin to second nature. And this is what it looks like. So repetitive scenarios and branching, sort of spanning tree scenarios, so that you can replicate kind of that wild card approach that is unfortunately daily patient care. So from a healthcare standpoint, simulation training I'm a big believer in. I think it has the potential to provide training on generic cases. It has the potential to create a foundation for training. And I would hope that as simulation training gets more speed, the things that we do, the somewhat horrific things that we do in terms of maintenance of certification, are actually tied to simulation as opposed to sitting in a room and working through like 600 MCQs, which may or may not be relevant to your daily practice. So that's my hope for simulation and credentialing. One day the two will meet. So, and lastly, microbiology meets fantasy, the healing blade. So our little game. So about 3 years ago, I had a discussion with some student nurses on rounds in the ICU. And the discussion was, Dr. Mathews, how do you choose the right antibiotic for the right infection? And I had been playing a video game called Mass Effect the night before, and it's just a fascinating game. Sorry, this is not going to turn into the Mass Effect gushing session. I promised my wife that. But that company that made the game Mass Effect is pretty fascinating. BioWare, founded by 3 physicians of all things, and really just focus on character development and strategic play. So when you engage the enemy in Mass Effect, you have to you're making a lot of decisions. You're making decisions like, what weapons should I use? What are my enemy's weaknesses? Should I send scouting parties in advance to get that information? So you're doing reconnaissance and you're making assumptions based on sort of the information that you have at hand. You do the same exact thing when you're admitting a patient from the ER. If that patient has an infiltrate on the chest x-ray, an elevated white count, and a fever, really you're thinking about pneumonia. However, if you've been a good doctor and done a good history and physical exam, and you realize that patient's coming from a nursing home versus the community and is elderly versus young, that adjusts your probabilities as to what kinds of organisms you want to be treating for. So all of a sudden I had this epiphany, oh my goodness, I'm doing a lot of the same things that I'm doing in this game that I love that I'm doing in my day-to-day practice of medicine, and specifically the task of choosing the antibiotic for the infection. And so then we had some discussions, my wife, a friend, Dr. Francis Kong, and we said, how do we take that concept and expand upon it and make it compelling? And the Lord of the Rings movies were just coming out, and we were just smitten with those things. And so we thought, well, let's take this world, let's re-envision it in a different planet a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Let's have 2 opposing sides. One side called the apothecary healers, named after actual antibiotics, and one side called the lords of pestilence, named after different species of bacteria. And we would build a game engine that would actually reflect the true nature of known sensitivities of certain bacteria with antibiotics. And we would also build in some little neat things like the ability to create resistance against particular antibiotics as well. And that was kind of the impetus for this game, the Healing Blade. So as it happened, Francis happened to be rooming with an art director who had access to a fantastic group of artists. And so then began this incredible journey of, okay, Bacillus anthracis, what should that bacteria look like? What causes anthrax? And when you see an anthrax cutaneous sore, it has central necrosis, and it's black, and it looks scary, and anthrax releases spores, so we want to kind of capture all of that in the imagery. And similarly, in these certain antibiotics, erythromycin under spectroscopy has a reddish color, so her armor should be red. And so we wanted to sort of embed as many little Easter eggs into the imagery as possible, as well as an understanding of which antibiotics and which bacteria kind of work against each other. The really exciting part was creating a lore and a backstory for each of these characters. And in fact, that's what Simrit was referring to. Our next project based on this game, The Healing Blade, was actually something called the Bacteria Nomicon, which is a monster manual which has all of the characters from our game, but we hired this fantastic medical writer and we all worked with her to create these impressive, deep backstories of these characters that actually relate to their real-world counterparts. And so that was the concept we put on Kickstarter, and we raised some money, and so we're very excited about the fact that there are more microbiology geeks on the planet than we were originally anticipating. So that was the Healing Blade experiment. Next up, we wanted to explore the concept of diagnosis. And you know, when you are sitting down looking at various presentations of different patients, you have to, I think the better doctors are the ones that are disciplined to create something called a differential diagnosis. And the differential diagnosis becomes sort of the basis of everything that you do. It starts, the highest on the differential diagnosis you're testing for, but then if those tests come back and don't really reflect anything, then you go down to differential and you continue to kind of expound upon that. Interestingly, the differential diagnosis is one of the hardest things from an AI standpoint to replicate. And that's the part that leaves me comfortable, reasonably comfortable, with the fact that human beings will continue to have a role in medical science despite the world of Watson that we are entering. So we created a game called Occam's Razor, which looks at 14 different conditions, generates a series of symptoms, signs, laboratory and imaging cards, and the card game works in such a way. So if you play the game poker, what you're trying to do is create a hand that beats another hand. So you have an ontology of hands, right? So two of a kind, so three of a kind beats two of a kind, and then you have flushes and you have full houses and things like that. And everyone kind of knows that ontology. And so as you play, you get to these hands and one hand defeats another, and that's how you play rounds. Well, what if instead of those traditional card suits, which are hearts, clubs, spades, and diamonds, what if we switch them over into symptom, signs, labs, and imaging? And in fact, the hand that supports a single diagnosis is akin to your royal flush. So that becomes the high hand. And that is essentially the premise behind the concept of Occam's Razor. And so here's a little promo video kind of explaining that. So that is Occam's, named after the sort of diagnostic concept of Occam's razor, which is if you have it's more likely that one disease is creating a constellation of symptoms than multiple diseases creating multiple symptoms.
Is this the Kickstarter venture?
No, this is something else. The Kickstarter venture was the Bacteria Nomicon, and I can actually pull up some imagery from that as well. So, breakthroughs to cures. This is a pretty interesting concept, and this goes into something called crowdfunding or crowdsourcing of ideas. Breakthroughs to Cures was an initiative started, I forget, oh gosh, I think it's UMass that initially envisioned it. But really, they created this sort of scenario where they announced and kind of on social media that this small fictitious country was experiencing this viral outbreak, and they were engaging kind of the world to kind of figure out examples, figure out how to contain and manage this specific issue. So, you know, there's a lot of signal to noise stuff, but from this crowdsourced experiment came some really powerful concepts regarding quarantining that truthfully had not been explored before. And so this led to effective and efficient strategies to potentially improve medical research. I don't know too much about it, but I loved the idea of opening it up to kind of the brain trust that is the internet. And if you have effective filtering mechanisms to, you know, to weed out the cat videos, then I think you have the potential to expound on the brain trust that is the internet. So, which speaks to an additional point regarding crowdsourcing of ideas. And we live in an amazing time where if you have a concept and you're passionate about that concept, and you can convince someone to hold a camera and have you pitch about that concept and put it on a crowdfunding site, if it resonates with enough people, then the whole thing that traditionally held up innovation, which was, you know, the initial marketing, the seed money, the initial capitalization, begging your family and friends, at the exchange of equity. The genius of Kickstarter is that you don't lose equity with Kickstarter. These are donations for T-shirts or actually the product. And on top of that, they energize the process of actually marketing as well. So your crowdfunding campaign in one fell swoop also becomes your marketing campaign, which we're still kind of reeling from what happened with the whole Kickstarter experience. But that's what I wanted to convey to the group. 5 years ago, you know, we would be taking these bizarre ideas and trying to bootstrap them with our own funds. And to me, there's nothing more powerful than testing out the concept and having the internet brain trust vote with their wallets if they feel that this is a compelling enough concept. Now, understandably, there's room for fraud and manipulation, and that's where, you know, you would hope the groups like Kickstarter and Indiegogo and the multiple other crowdfunding sites have editorial boards to weed some of that out. But I'm just, you know, the idea, we live in, I think, the age of ideas now, and truthfully, the execution of those ideas because of this thing called the internet. And
by the way, I have the T-shirt to prove it.
Yeah. Oh, there you go. That's right. That's right. And lastly, in the concept of crowdsourcing both innovation ideas and funding, we have to talk about the crowdsourcing of the actual work of specifically protein folding. So Foldit was a distributed open source platform that, as an experiment, they put on, I think, PlayStation 2s or 3s, and they invited folks from around the world to just kind of play this sort of 3D folding game, which actually had to do with the folding of protein molecules in real time. And so what happened was not only did they make substantial progress without the use of a supercomputer And supercomputers cost a lot of money. If you're leasing supercomputer time, you're burning through your funding money. It created, truthfully, a platform for distributed problem solving, which, again, we live in this world. This time is now that this stuff is happening. So just blown away by that. So I think I have talked your ears off enough. In a nutshell, game elements successfully applied can motivate people to engage more with their health. Healthcare practitioners can use games to extend their effectiveness and empower people to stay with their treatment plan and do preventative activities. Games shift our mentality on health. They can transform a difficult, undesirable, frustrating task into a fun experience. And they can also be very powerful in terms of teaching practitioners, student practitioners of the medical arts in new and compelling ways, and that's the education standpoint. So thank you again for taking time out of a busy week on a Thursday evening to listen to our little malarkey regarding game design, and I would be happy to answer any questions. And we have some samples of, these are two of the games that we've created, but I also specifically want to take a few moments to tell you about this particular game. This is made by a group called the Action Mill, based in Philadelphia. It's a game called My Gift of Grace. My wife is a palliative care physician, and so she knows firsthand how, and I'm speaking for you, and I apologize, but when you walk into a situation regarding end-of-life care, and those discussions have not happened on the front end and are happening in a moment of duress and stress, so much heartache can be saved by the simplicity of just having that conversation weeks, months, potentially years in advance, and documenting that. So these brilliant folks at My Gift of Grace created a game that really is a game around a conversation. It's a designed experience where it's non-judgmental, you have game pieces, and really we sat down and did it with my parents, and at first everyone was like, haha, this is silly, you know, I want to make sure my cat's buried with me, things like that. But then the most amazing thing happened. Second round into the game, you start having the most real, riveting discussions, and based on those discussions, you make some decisions, and that's where gaming, you know, really, I think, can. That's an example of the potential of gaming unlocked, where gaming is just a pathway to good decision making, and so I wanted to give those folks a shout out. They're also crowdfunded, and we're big fans of their work. So my challenge to you is, you know, we're all facing various different interesting logistical problems day to day. What parts of those can be parsed out into something like a game? And is it possible that the game variant of that problem could actually be applied on a much larger scale to deal with similar types of problems around the country? And so we're big believers in it, and I want to thank you for letting us come out and tell you a little bit about it. So thank you again.
So why does the Healing Blade website say it's sold out?
Because we are in fact sold out. Our second edition